Sheldon and Zach, we haven't met, but let me just introduce myself. I'm Andrea Fogelman, and I am one of the co-chairs for the Citizens Advisory Committee. And Ed, you want to introduce yourself?
You bet. I had the opportunity. We know Sheldon, of course, and Ed Lodge, with also on the advisory committee representing the Western Idaho Fair. And I just want to thank everyone for their time this afternoon.
So we don't have, I don't think, any questions right off, Sheldon and Zach, but we want, of course, to hear about floodplain issues on that property. So one of you want to jump in and start talking, and we'll ask questions along the way.
Okay, Andrea, this is Sheldon, and I think I'll start.
Great.
I have some graphics I'd like to share, but before I do, I thought maybe I'd briefly describe the process because it is straightforward and fairly simple, and I'd like to kind of keep it that way for everybody who's listening. The flood issues are dealt with by FEMA, Flood Emergency Management Agency, and they deal with all kinds of emergency management, whether it's hurricanes, floods, or earthquakes, whatever. And certainly they deal with flooding. And they have a routine cycle they go through across the country where they plot floodplain and floodway information of major rivers. And by regulatory guidelines, they can do this every 5 years. But in fact, they're so busy, they don't come anywhere close to doing it that frequently. If you look, in fact, at the last 2 cycles they've gone through on the Boise River, there was one in 2001, and then there was a new model developed actually 16 years later, not till then, in 2017. So I'm going to refer to these as the 2001 and 2017 models. So let me go ahead and start, and I think I can do this with share. Okay, so there's 2, let me know, folks, if you cannot see this.
See it now.
Okay, there's 2 areas they define. They define what's called the floodway, and they define what's called the floodplain. And we'll try to keep simple definitions of those. The floodway is really the basic course of the river down which the flood waters are carried. And the floodplain is the area that would be inundated in a flood of a 100-year frequency. So we'll just start with that and kind of walk through it.
Okay.
So the first graph, I hope you all can see, is the floodway. And what you see is blue. And when it says flood, I'll just explain the legend, excuse me. But the first one is blue, and it says floodway no change. So a way to understand that was the floodway in 2001 was modeled and defined. And that part of the floodway had no change when the model was updated in 2017. And then you see a couple of different colors for floodway additions, very minor, and some areas where the model showed the floodway was no longer in that particular area. So that's the floodway. The more complicated issue, let's see if I do page down, I guess I can't. Okay, the more complicated issue for us is the floodplain item. And again, you can see here the Boise River, the floodplain no change, and that would be from the 2001 model. The floodplain deletions, those that when they modeled them, were no longer in the floodplain, and the floodplain additions. Now, the floodplain additions is what's really important as we understand the impacts. If you look at a map much bigger than this one for all of Garden City, back in the 2001 model, Garden City had a relatively small area that was defined in the floodplain. But when they did the upgrade in 2017, it dramatically changed. And I would more or less guess that somewhere around 2/3 of the entire area of Garden City is now in the floodplain. So you can imagine this causes a lot of concern. And let me further explain for those of, and Andrea, I suspect you know because you live on the river, but for those of you who aren't familiar with this, if you have a home that's got a mortgage and all of a sudden you're defined in the floodplain, you are going to have to buy flood insurance. Your lender is probably going to require it. And the flood insurance, if you're not in the floodplain, is relatively nominal, several $100s. But if you are in the floodplain, you're up to a couple thousand, order of magnitude almost more. So it was a dramatic impact when all of a sudden this new model was released. So what Garden City decided to do was to apply for what's called a seclusion. And they secluded the entire city. And while the fairgrounds isn't really Garden City property, it is surrounded by Garden City and therefore is included in this seclusion. And what the seclusion means is it gives the city a chance to enhance their flood protection, and they really have until the next cycle. Now that could be in 5 years, but as we saw from the last cycle, it was 3 times that. So they probably have a little more time than that. Garden City has applied for a grant from the Army Corps, United States Army Corps of Engineers, to do some studying. And because of the complexities of it, it's probably going to require a congressional support, which in this election year probably isn't likely to happen. So Garden City is still very intent on doing this. The Corps of Engineers still very much wants to have it done. And it'll probably start, I'm just guessing now when it gets approved, but hopefully sometime next year. And I'm giving you all this by way of background because it does probably tie into what steps, if Garden City decides to put some berms in or some dikes, it may be very logical to be compatible with that, with whatever is done on the fairgrounds. The only other thing I want to say is that formally now, both Boise and Garden City's city councils, have adopted the 2007 model, Garden City with a seclusion. But what that also means is that once the floodplain is finally defined, any homes that are built or any structure that's built must be 2 feet, the bottom floor must be 2 feet above the floodplain elevation for that site. And just one more small detail, if a lot of homes in the valley are built with what's called stem wall construction, where you have the concrete and your floor is a little bit above, well, FEMA defines that crawl space elevation as the first floor. So you'd have to have that 2 feet above the floodplain, and that's why you see a number of homes being built now in Garden City with just concrete grade on slab construction. So that gives you a little bit of background. And as you can see in looking at this map, the floodplain additions have added a significant amount of area. Now, just defining these 2 areas, the floodway is pretty formal. It's pretty hard to get that changed. It would take a lot of different agency interaction, professional hydraulic engineer modeling. The floodplain is a little easier to deal with, as we've just described how you might elevate your homes and or put in dikes or something to change the actual floodplain location. So we've shown the first graph, which shows the floodway. We've shown the second graph, which shows the floodplain, and now a third graph, which kind of combines it all. But Zach came up with this, which was very helpful, so you can see these different lines. These lines are exactly the same location, but you can see now the buildings from the fairgrounds on there, so you can kind of see what structures are impacted. And I guess, Andrea, with that, I think I pretty much covered the key issues, and Zach and I would be open to questions. Zach, did I leave anything out?
No, I think you covered everything, covered it well.
We did cover that well, Sheldon. Thank you very much. I guess one of the questions that I have in this time of seclusion, are we still restricted from building on site? Does it still have to be the 2 feet above the floodplain?
Probably we should get some really good clarification from Garden City on that. I think what the seclusion does is it says that everything that was in effect on the 2001 model is still in effect. So if you get to the 2 feet over the 2001 model, and then that turns out after the seclusion no longer to be the case, you could be at some risk.
Okay, so in the areas that they have added, the additional areas that were in pink there,
Yes.
What effect does the seclusion or the fact that they've been added, what about buildings that are currently in those locations? Are they like other?
Well, let's keep going. Do you have a specific question about those buildings? I'm not sure what you mean. There are no homes out there. They're owned by the county or University of Idaho or whatever. So they're fine. I mean, they're not required to have flood insurance.
Okay.
Am I helping, Andrew? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So like the buildings that are used at Expo Idaho right now aren't going to have any requirements to move or elevate or do anything different than they're doing right now.
I think that's correct.
Okay.
However, Andrea, I do want to note, so you see all of those barns that are currently in the floodway. One of the challenges that we have is those are so dilapidated that if we were to touch them at all, and Zach, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't believe you could build any new structures where those are, even if we wanted to update them.
Very good point, Brianna, and I'm sorry I didn't say that. Yes, we need to treat the floodway and the floodplain different. There's a lot more flexibility in what goes on in the floodplain than what goes on in the floodway.
Yeah, that's all correct. So think of the seclusion zone as a future potential. So the county or Garden City or City of Boise is not going to hold anybody to anything in the seclusion zone until the future time.
That's helpful.
I think it is. I look at the 2017 model and I think, okay, this is probably pretty, it's good to know that this area in a 100-year flood would be inundated. Okay. And that's not to say that it's not, we can go through and the data is all available to show you what the level of inundation would be. It may take nothing more than, bringing in some fill material to put you above the floodplain. And there's less restriction on that, doing that in the floodplain. It would be much, much harder to try to have an approach like that in the floodway, but you could do it in the floodplain.
Okay.
So you can, sorry, Sheldon, kind of flood-proof structures in the floodplain.
Good way to think of it.
Okay. Yeah. Like raising foundations up or whatever.
Yeah, just bringing in fill and just raising it up.
Okay. And is this what you were going to get to? Like the mitigation of, I don't know if that's the right word exactly, but around the river itself, like things to, like flood control systems, I guess?
I know that Garden City, because they have so much land area that is now in this floodplain, they are going to have to really consider some major alternatives. And, to start putting in dikes that, I'll give you an example. To put in a dike that meets Corps of Engineers approval for, changing the floodplain, you have to have a dike that has absolutely no vegetation on it. Nothing. If you put a tree on there, they're worried about the roots going into the dike and potentially making the dike vulnerable to a flood. So if you were to put a dike in there, you might have some people in Boise who really like, the green belt through there. All I'm trying to say is there's going to be some hard choices to be made as we move forward, because we all love the river and we all want that enhanced green belt, and it's shaded along the river and you have the nice trees and everything. But that kind of a structure wouldn't meet the Corps of Engineers definition for a formal dike. I know because the firm I worked for used to do dike certifications, and we were very, very careful when we did those. Nothing but grass on a dike. Does that, I don't mean to make it overly complicated, but I'm just trying to explain the trade-offs, and I think that Garden City is looking at somehow they're going to have to try to probably make some fairly significant investment.
Okay. Is there, can I ask some other questions about this, or did you have more to your presentation?
No, I'm done, I think.
Or Zach, I don't know. So I guess my question is kind of like two parts. One is, are there things that can be done upstream from here that would affect this? I mean, I guess the answer is probably yes, but I don't know how likely any of that is, right?
A great idea. Let me try and answer.
Sure.
I'm not as familiar with the south side of the river, but I know, for example, if you look at the river in Glenwood, northeast of that is all Riverside subdivision up there. And that is now all in the new model floodplain, but currently secluded. But one of the things that, one of the ways that the city might consider solving that problem would be to put actually a dike parallel to Glenwood, north of the river, because you also have some land masses already there. And so you're really more worried about water maybe just coming across Glenwood around the Glenwood Bridge and into that northeast area. So you might actually not have a dike in the neighborhood, but have a dike on Glenwood, let's say, and that could prevent that area from flooding. So I think the answer to your question is yes. There may be things that are done upstream that help remove the fairgrounds from a flood zone. That's why I think whatever we do at the fairgrounds, we need to work with Garden City.
Mm-hmm.
Does
Okay.
that help?
It does, except I got confused, maybe because I'm just directionally challenged, but isn't Glenwood downriver from the site?
I'm sorry, I was not talking about the site. I was giving another example of how they might put a dike in upstream of a neighborhood, just a north-south dike upstream of that whole area. And as a result of that, really not need any dikes in the area. You asked the question, could they do something upstream? I'm trying to give an example of where they maybe, yes, could do that.
Okay, gotcha. And likewise, there are some properties upstream from the Expo site that would potentially incorporate something that would protect more of this area for different uses.
And
I guess theoretically,
I'm
right?
saying that might be true, but it's not yet been studied much.
Gotcha.
So I wouldn't want to say, oh, sure, because I that's the question I just don't know the answer to.
Sure.
But I hope so. Yes.
Okay. One other question is, so looking at this image you have up on the screen and looking through the lens that you are looking through right now, both of you, Zach and Sheldon, if you were purely going to make recommendations for the Expo Idaho site based on this floodplain map, right? As far as what to put where or what might be compatible, how would you design, like what would you suggest in the site design or redesign?
Let me give an example. We've talked about, for example, you in the floodway, and Zach, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but in the floodway, we could make that a park riparian area. Just know it would be flooded in the event of a flood. Mm-hmm. So you could take the horse stables out and almost make it a park, a sloped grassy area where the river could flow, and make that part of the park area that the greenbelt would connect to and would enhance. And so you could make it quite pretty, I think, and enhance it. But it would be in the floodway, and it would be when we had a major flood, it would be underwater, or parts of it would be.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So in general, floodways, they can remain open. It's kind of coveted because everything's being filled in the river as it is. So if that remains open, it benefits other river properties, I guess. And if you're going to do anything in the floodway, it's more expensive and takes more time.
Okay.
So just to submit something in the floodway to FEMA is $8,000 just to submit, and then you got 20,000 plus in engineering.
Your engineering would have to have a professional engineer do a model indicating that, okay, this park that we're putting in lieu of the stables, for example, will not raise the river during the 100-year flood, which is like 17,000 cubic feet per second.
Mm-hmm.
The
Okay.
elevation wouldn't be any higher as a result of what work we did than it is already.
Okay. So it's kind of cool that there's not too much stuff in the floodway on this site right now. Like
Yes.
we sort of lucked out there a little bit. Okay.
And it can be, I think it would be worth the effort to make it into a park and make it a beautiful, kind of synergistic with whatever else is done there.
Zach and Sheldon and maybe others, you gave the example of a park, right? Of a place where, it could be compatible with, like it could not impact river flow negatively. And were it to flood, it would be recoverable in a relatively less expensive way, probably, right? So park is an example. Are there other things like I'm picturing something maybe more along the lines of like a restored wetlands area with boardwalks and viewing platforms. Maybe that's a version of a park, but when you say park, I think of like a green park with like some kind of rec facilities or something, like, can you give us a sense of, I'm not asking you to be planners or urban designers, but just from, again, the floodway perspective, are there some things that you've seen that would be more appropriate or even sort of like contributory, like good neighborly for protecting the river and maybe even, helping with flood control to some
I'm not sure I have a straightforward, easy answer.
extent?
Like I think it's all part of what needs to be looked at. If, for example, you were saying a platform went out, certainly you'd have to model that platform. You'd have some support posts for the platform. Would that change the flow? So I think we can be creative, but I think all those things would have to be considered. Not sure I'm
And
giving
the
you a
other,
simple
another,
answer to that.
yeah, and along the wetlands line, there is a benefit to that. So there's FEMA flood control that we're talking about, but there's also the Army Corps of Engineers wetland mitigation and delineation. So you can mix those two. You can have a wetland flow through area that is a benefit for habitat, wildlife to the core, that also functions for FEMA in terms of the floodway. So there is lots of options along those lines that you're talking.
Okay, thanks.
What was that, Ellen? You
Oh.
broke up.
Sorry, I just said thank you. That's all.
Oh, great. I have just a quick question. The islands that are just off site of the property now, because they're in that floodway, I assume that they are unusable for any purpose. Is that correct?
Well, define purpose. Again, Andrea, I think you could, and I hope we would, make those islands connect with bridges and have those be parks. Just knowing it's it's not that different than a lot of the greenbelt today. Under every one of our major bridges, they flood and close during the high waters. And I would see this being similar. I hope we can incorporate those islands, build some bridges to them, just with the understand, and maybe have some more parks out there where people can walk around and fish and other things. Just understand that when we have high flows, they'll be inaccessible.
Sure. Okay.
Cool.
Ed,
That's exciting. Yeah.
yeah, that is exciting. Ed, did you have any other questions?
Just a quick one too, Sheldon. When you mentioned the Garden City's our request, the Army Corps of Engineers for that study, you mentioned congressional approval. Is that like a budget appropriation to FEMA, or do you know how that process would work?
Ed, I have to admit to just not quite understanding that. They have applied for a grant to do the initial study. Apparently, that grant says that you cannot, the project can't cost more than 13 million to implement, and this is going to cost a lot more than that to build dikes. And so they're not. It's called I think it's called a 205 grant. Therefore, they're not sure they can use a 205 grant. And therefore, I think that's where the congressional support comes in. And I wouldn't try to tell you exactly the process. I just know they're eager to do it, and the Corps of Engineers is optimistic that they will get grant funding.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Sheldon. And the questions I had, you answered very well. I appreciate your presentation. It's been great. Thank you.
Good. Enjoyed putting it together.
Can I ask, I'm just trying to think what other questions the committee or members of the public who are watching this might have. We've had discussions in some of our meetings about possibly moving some of the uses on the site, the current uses on the site, to other places on the site. So things like parking or the fairgrounds or area that's used for the fair. So obviously structures in the floodway are, we can't put new structures there. But if it were something like a parking lot or an area that's used during the fair, like for vendors or something like that, how doable would moving some of or even like the RV, since there's not infrastructure being built there, if it's just a parking lot or somewhere that the RVs can park, are there other uses on the site that could be moved to the floodway from where they're currently at if they don't have any structures?
And do you guys mind scrolling so we can see the top of the map?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I think it would be helpful.
Is that what you want right
Yeah.
there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to say, and I'm going to go back to the bottom, this Lady Bird Park area, potentially, I know that takes some effort to move it, but that's one thing you could put in the floodway, potentially.
What about
in
this?
terms of
Yeah, go ahead.
in terms of uses in the floodway, you can do things that are not going to permanently obstruct floodwaters, and there's a temporary time frame on those things. So parking over there, that kind of thing, if it's temporary, it's not going to obstruct flood flows in high flows, then that's something that's a possibility.
So like a grassy ball field that sometimes gets repurposed for temporary parking or something kind of thing might work.
Yeah, that's good. And the only warning with that is if something is damaged, there becomes a point where FEMA will not provide funds to fix that item if it's repetitively destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess looking at this, if it comes into effect, I mean, a lot of the site, like that, basically the area outside the floodway, inside the floodplain, just costs more to develop in a way that is like appropriately engineered, I guess. Is that right?
Yes, I
Okay,
think that's a good summary.
okay. And anything that's there existing, like kind of stays, is that true until and unless it gets moved? Like there's not a retrofitting requirement per se, just a flood insurance requirement that would come into effect? That kind of,
For private property where, yes.
Okay.
Especially true where you have government assisted mortgages.
okay. Gotcha. I was just thinking of facilities like, well, all the facilities that are inside that line, they wouldn't move per se, but they would need to be protected by insurance in a different way.
You know, yes, if you built a facility there that, and you just put it on the current, if the county or a government agency built a facility there and just put it on the current elevation, you know, in the floodplain, I don't think anybody's going to say you can't do that. But people might look back when there was a flood and the first foot or two was underwater, you know, why
Right.
did you do that?
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions? Or Zach or Sheldon, is there anything, are there any questions we should have asked and didn't?
I don't think so. I kind of wrote some notes down of things I wanted to make sure and cover. And I think you've asked some good questions and probably gone beyond what I know in some of the technical areas. But yes, I think we've got it pretty well covered.
Great. It's been very informative.
Good.
I learned a lot, so I thank you for that. So I think we're done, and we'll see you, Sheldon, at the meeting. And thank you, Zach, for spending your time with us.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.